Somewhere in your journey, you experienced something that felt like a breakthrough. It might have come after years of searching, or suddenly after a personal breakdown. One moment you were living in the ordinary rhythm of life, chasing goals, fighting fears, and trying to keep up with society's expectations. Then, suddenly, something shifted. You saw through the illusion, the endless striving, the games of validation, the false identities. They all appeared for what they really were. For a brief time, this realization felt like liberation. There was clarity. There was silence. There was a feeling that maybe finally you had found something real. But then, almost without warning, the opposite happened. The fire that once drove you went out. The meaning that filled your days began to vanish. Slowly, quietly, you stopped caring. Not in a reckless way, but in a detached, almost numb way, and you asked yourself the haunting question, why do I feel empty after awakening? The unexpected emptiness. When people imagine awakening, they picture bliss, energy, purpose. They expect a surge of joy and clarity, but the truth is often the opposite. Awakening doesn't always ignite passion. Sometimes it extinguishes it. This paradox confuses seekers. They thought awakening would be the summit, the final reward after years of inner work. Instead, they find themselves in a fog, disoriented, detached, and strangely unmotivated. I once knew someone deeply devoted to spirituality. She read Tolle, Krishnamurti, Alan Watts. She longed for awakening, believing it would make life radiant. And one day, after a long period of struggle, she broke through. She described it as ego dissolving, as merging with something vast. She was ecstatic. But 2 months later, she confessed, I don't care about anything anymore. My goals, my passions, even the things I used to love, they all feel empty. Her story is not unique. Thousands of seekers report the same thing. This is where Carl Jung helps us understand what's really happening. Carl Jung's hidden insight. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, didn't speak in modern awakening language, but he deeply understood the psychological mechanics behind this experience. Jung said, enlightenment does not come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Awakening isn't just a moment of bliss. It's also the collapse of illusions. It tears away the mask you've worn, the persona that once gave you identity, goals, and direction. Without that mask, the old motivations lose power. You no longer care about proving yourself, chasing recognition, or playing society's game. But without those drives, you feel lost, empty, stuck. This is not depression in the ordinary sense. It is not laziness. It is the natural pause that happens when the old self has died but the new self has not yet been born. Jung would call this the void. A sacred pause that allows the unconscious to rise and the deeper self to take form. Why motivation collapses for most of your life? Your energy came from the ego identity. That me wanted approval, safety, belonging, achievement. It ran on comparison, competition, and ambition. Awakening strips that identity. Suddenly, you see the chase for what it is, the striving, the endless need to prove something. And, once you see through it, you cannot unsee it. But here's the problem. Without that ego-driven fuel, nothing seems worth doing. You feel like an actor who's walked off stage but hasn't been given new lines. The old script is gone, but the new one hasn't appeared yet. This is why you feel numb, not because you are failing, but because your psyche is recalibrating. The sacred pause, the void. Our culture doesn't understand this stage. Society worships productivity and constant progress. So when you fall into stillness, you get labeled lazy, unmotivated, depressed. But Jung saw this differently. He recognized the void as essential for transformation. He compared it to individuation, the process of integrating unconscious material and aligning with the deeper self. Think of it like a caterpillar in a cocoon. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But inside, the caterpillar is dissolving completely, breaking down into formless matter before reorganizing into a butterfly. The same happens after awakening. You dissolve. The goals that once defined you break apart. The motivations that once drove you fall silent. It looks like nothing, but in reality, something profound is being rebuilt. The psychological death, awakening in truth, is not the climax of your story. It is a kind of funeral, the death of your old self. Everything that once gave you direction, career, validation, ambitions, collapses, and that collapse feels like emptiness. But emptiness is not the end. It is the beginning of a new form of life. Jung would say this process is individuation, the transformation from a fragmented identity into wholeness. But the journey doesn't look glamorous. It looks like staring at the ceiling, questioning everything while the world continues its hustle around you. It looks like stillness. But in that stillness, the deeper self begins to awaken. The hidden wisdom of the void. The great misunderstanding of awakening is the belief that it immediately brings joy. In reality, it first brings silence. You swing from one extreme to another. From striving to stillness, from ambition to emptiness, from chasing everything to caring about nothing. This is not regression. It is the psyche balancing itself. The void is not failure. It is initiation. But because our culture despises stillness, you misinterpret it. You call it laziness. You think you are broken. But your psyche is wise. It withdraws your motivation on purpose, so you cannot escape into distraction. It forces you to witness your own shadows, your own unconscious patterns. This is why Jung said the task is not to chase light, but to make the darkness conscious. The truth about this stage. So if you feel lost right now, understand this. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are not lazy. You are dissolving. The old self has died. The new self is not yet born. You are in between, and this in between is sacred. The emptiness you feel is not meaningless. It is the space being cleared for meaning to return in a form you cannot yet imagine. Part 1. Ending transition. This is the paradox of awakening. It begins with death, not life. With emptiness, not clarity. With silence, not motivation. And yet, in this silence, in this void, the true self waits to emerge. In Part 2, we'll dive deeper into how Jung described this transformation, the individuation process, shadow work, and how to move through the void without mistaking it for despair. When the fire of awakening burns down the old self, you are left standing in silence. The world feels the same, but you feel different. The goals that once gave you direction no longer move you. The mask you wore for years, the persona that helped you play society's game, is gone. And now, you are in the void. Most people panic here. They try to force themselves back into old identities. They chase new spiritual highs, cling to affirmations, or distract themselves with endless consumption, but none of it satisfies. Because the void is not an error. It is a doorway. Carl Jung understood this phase better than most modern teachers. He knew that when the unconscious rises, it doesn't come as light first. It comes as shadow. What is shadow work? Jung defined the shadow as the collection of parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or suppress. The anger we pretend we don't feel. The jealousy we condemn in others. The fears we bury under productivity. Even the talents we hide because they don't fit the identity we built. The shadow is not just darkness. It is everything we pushed away in order to survive in society. When awakening dissolves the persona, the shadow comes rushing back. Suddenly, you are face to face with all the parts of yourself you ignored. That is why awakening often feels heavy instead of blissful. You are not only seeing the truth of the world, you are seeing the truth of yourself. Why the shadow appears. After awakening, before awakening, your ego had a job to protect your identity. It kept you busy chasing success, approval, and security. That chase served as a shield, covering the unconscious material underneath. But when awakening collapses the chase, the shield drops. And what rises is not always pretty. It is the repressed emotions, the wounds, the unmet needs. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is why awakening feels like emptiness. The ego is gone, the new self is unborn, and in between is the shadow, asking to be seen." The process of individuation, Jung believed that human development has a deeper purpose than just survival or success. He called this purpose individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, integrating the unconscious with the conscious, the shadow with the persona, the ego with the self. It is not about perfection. It is about wholeness. Think of your psyche like a vast map. Most of your life you live in one small corner of it, the persona. Individuation expands your territory. It forces you to reclaim the parts of yourself you abandoned. It brings you closer to the self, the deeper center that connects you to life itself. Awakening is the trigger, but individuation is the journey that follows. The hermit phase, death before rebirth. Ancient traditions describe this phase as the hermit stage, the desert, the underworld. It is the symbolic death that comes before rebirth. In mythology, heroes often descend into the underworld before returning with wisdom. Orpheus goes into Hades. Inanna descends to the underworld. Christ spends 3 days in the tomb. The pattern is universal. Transformation requires descent. After awakening, you are in that descent. The old goals have died, but the new orientation has not yet appeared. You are the caterpillar dissolving into soup inside the cocoon. This feels terrifying because society teaches us to fear stillness. But in truth, this pause is sacred. It is here that individuation begins. Common traps after awakening. Spiritual bypassing. Pretending everything is light, avoiding the shadow, and numbing out. People convince themselves nothing matters, but secretly they feel empty. Ego rebranding. The old ambition returns, but now dressed in spiritual clothes. Instead of chasing money, people chase enlightenment certificates or spiritual followers. Despair and nihilism, mistaking the void for meaninglessness. Thinking. Awakening has ruined life instead of realizing it is clearing space for deeper meaning. Jung warned against all three. He said the task is not to escape the shadow, but to integrate it. Not to deny the ego, but to align it with the self. Shadow work in practice. So how do you begin shadow work? Awareness. Notice what triggers you in others. Projection is the shadow's favorite disguise. The traits you hate in others are often the ones you repress in yourself. Compassion. Instead of rejecting these parts, approach them with curiosity. Ask, why is this here? What does this part of me need? Integration. Accept that you are both light and dark. Your anger can become strength. Your fear can become sensitivity. Your wounds can become wisdom. Shadow work is not glamorous. It is not posting enlightened quotes. It is sitting with discomfort and discovering the gold hidden inside it. Ego death and confusion. Another reason motivation collapses after awakening is that the ego feels like it has died. But Jung would say the ego never truly disappears. It just loses its old map. The persona, the version of you that was built to fit society, collapses. Without it, you feel like no one. That confusion is part of individuation. The ego must now align with the self instead of dominating it. This is why Jung believed individuation was the true spiritual path, not dissolving the ego forever, but transforming its role. The ego becomes a servant of the self instead of the master. Why this stage feels endless. Many seekers feel stuck here for months or even years. They wonder why their spark hasn't returned. But individuation is not a quick process. It unfolds slowly, through cycles of descent and integration. Jung compared it to alchemy, the ancient practice of turning lead into gold. The lead is your unconscious material, your shadow. The gold is the self, the wholeness that emerges when you integrate. Alchemy took years of patient work. So does individuation. The void feels endless because your psyche is reorganizing at a deep level. It is not just about finding new goals. It is about finding a new foundation for living. The turning point. Here's the hope. The void does not last forever. Something begins to stir. A new kind of motivation rises, but it feels different from the old drive. It is quieter, steadier, more aligned. This is the self beginning to guide you. Instead of chasing validation, you begin to follow resonance. Instead of forcing ambition, you follow what feels authentic. Jung called this living symbolically, guided by dreams, synchronicities, intuition. Life begins to unfold not as a checklist, but as a dialogue with the deeper self. Real-life example. I once spoke with a man who spent his entire life in corporate hustle. He climbed the ladder, earned recognition, and built wealth. Then, after a sudden awakening, he could not bring himself to work anymore. He felt guilty, lazy, broken. For months, he sat in silence. He explored his dreams. He journaled his shadows. Slowly, he realized he had built his entire life on someone else's definition of success. From that silence, a new direction emerged. He became a therapist, helping others navigate transitions, not because he wanted recognition, but because it felt authentic. That is individuation in action. The old persona dissolved. The self emerged, the sacred middle phase. If you are in this phase, understand, you are not lost. You are in transition. You are walking the bridge between the old identity and the new self. The bridge feels like emptiness, but it is not. It is a sacred passage. Jung described this as enantiodromia, the swinging of opposites. From striving to stillness, from ego to self, from external goals to inner truth. This swing is not failure. It is balance being restored. Conclusion of Part 2: The Shadow, the Void, the Ego Death. These are not detours. They are the path itself. Individuation is not about escaping humanity, but about becoming fully human, whole, integrated, authentic. So if you feel empty, numb, or unmotivated, know this. It is not the end. It is the middle, the cocoon stage, the sacred pause before rebirth. In Part 3, we'll explore what happens when the self begins to lead, how motivation returns in a soul-powered way, how symbolic life unfolds, and how to live with meaning beyond ego. When you've walked through the void, when the fire of old ambitions has burned out and the silence has stretched long, something subtle begins to shift. At first, it's not dramatic. There are no fireworks, no sudden lightning bolts of clarity. Instead, it feels like a quiet pull, a whisper you can barely hear. This is the return of motivation. But it is not the same motivation you once knew. The old fire, fueled by ego, comparison, and the need to prove yourself, is gone. In its place, a new flame begins to glow, steady, quiet, soul-powered. The self takes the lead. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, culminates when the self, the deeper center of your psyche, begins to guide your life. The ego doesn't vanish. It doesn't dissolve forever. Instead, it takes a new role, servant rather than master. It no longer dictates the script. It follows the deeper rhythm of the self. This is why after awakening, your motivation feels different. You're not pulled by anxiety or external pressure. You're guided by what feels true, what soul motivation feels like. Soul-led motivation isn't adrenaline. It doesn't come with the restless urgency of the old life. Instead, it feels like alignment, doing something because it resonates, not because it impresses. Curiosity, following what quietly calls, without needing to justify it. Peace, choosing paths that bring presence, not performance. Sustainability, energy that doesn't burn out, because it comes from within. Instead of dragging yourself through obligations, you begin to notice you want to create, serve, or explore, simply because it feels authentic. The symbolic life. Jung called this way of living the symbolic life. In the symbolic life, you no longer treat your experiences as random or meaningless. You see them as messages, patterns, and symbols from the deeper self. Dreams, synchronicities, intuitions, all become guiding lights. You stop asking, "What should I do to prove myself?" and instead ask, "What is life inviting me into?" It's not about fantasy or wishful thinking. It's about paying attention to the language of the psyche, the symbols through which your deeper self communicates. Practical shifts after awakening. Redefining ambition. Success is no longer about climbing ladders. It becomes about expressing truth, creating something real, and serving authentically. Saying no with clarity. You let go of roles, relationships, and tasks that no longer align. Even if they look good on paper, they don't feel right inside. Following resonance. Instead of chasing plans, you follow the subtle energy of what feels alive. Curiosity becomes your compass. Creating without an audience. You begin to write, paint, teach, or serve not because you must, but because your being says yes. These shifts mark the transition from ego-driven living to self-driven living. Ordinary but sacred, one of the great surprises of this stage is how ordinary it looks. Living from the self doesn't always mean moving to a monastery or meditating on mountaintops. Often, it means showing up to your everyday life with a new quality of presence. Cooking dinner becomes sacred. Talking to a stranger feels meaningful. Even your work, when aligned, becomes less about survival and more about expression. The self doesn't demand grandeur. It asks for authenticity. Integration of shadow. By now, you've met your shadow. You've faced the discomfort and unearthed repressed parts of yourself. As you integrate them, you become less fragmented. This integration fuels your new motivation. You're no longer pulled by unconscious wounds or hidden fears. Instead, your energy flows naturally, because you are whole. Jung believed this wholeness was the real goal of human life. Not perfection, not endless positivity. Wholeness. The new fire. The irony is that once you stop chasing motivation, it returns on its own, but in a transformed form. The old fire was fragile, easily extinguished by failure or criticism. The new fire is steady because it isn't tied to external approval. It burns from within. This new fire often expresses itself as creativity, service, teaching, healing, or simply living with deeper honesty. It doesn't need recognition. It flows naturally, because it is aligned with who you truly are. The journey never ends. It's tempting to think this is the final destination. But Jung would remind us, individuation is a lifelong process. The self continues to unfold in layers. The shadow continues to reveal itself in new forms. Awakening is not the end. It is the beginning of becoming. You will still face challenges, confusion, even moments of emptiness. But now you carry a compass inside you, the self. And that compass doesn't get lost. Closing reflection. So if you feel unmotivated after awakening, understand this. You didn't lose your spark. You outgrew the old fire. The void you've walked through was not punishment. It was preparation. It stripped away the false, so the true could emerge. And now, as the self begins to lead, you are discovering a new kind of motivation, one rooted not in ego, but in wholeness, not in proving, but in expressing. This is the paradox of awakening. It begins with emptiness, but ends with authenticity. It strips you down, but only so you can live from your depths. Awakening is not about escaping life. It's about entering it more fully, not with the restless hunger of the ego, but with the quiet flame of the soul.